Within this section, you will learn about cloud computing, and I will cover things such as cloud concepts, deployment models, and understanding shared responsibility in the cloud. After watching the cloud concept section, you'll be able to define cloud computing, describe the shared responsibility model, define cloud models including public, private, and hybrid, identify appropriate use cases for each cloud model, describe the consumption-based model, compare cloud pricing models. So what is cloud computing? A model for enabling on-demand access to shared pooled, configurable computing resources, servers, network, storage, applications, and services. Ubiquitous, convenient, on-demand network access, rapidly provisioned and released with minimal management effort or service provider interaction. Before, companies would have to stand up data centers, get it cooled, provide electricity, security. All this is taken care of by your vendor of choice, and in this case, we're talking about the Microsoft Azure cloud. You may have heard of the shared responsibility models, but you may not understand what it means or how it impacts cloud computing. Start with traditional corporate data centers. The company is responsible for maintaining the physical space, ensuring security, maintaining or replacing the servers if anything happens. The IT department is responsible for maintaining all of the infrastructure and software needed to keep the data center up and running. They're also likely to be responsible for keeping all the system patched and on the correct version. With the shared responsibility model, these responsibilities get shared between the cloud provider and the consumer. Physical security, power, cooling, and network connectivity are all the responsibility of the cloud provider, and in this case, Microsoft Azure. The consumer isn't co-located with the data center, so it wouldn't make sense for the consumer to have any of those responsibilities. At the same time, the consumer is responsible for the data and information stored in the cloud. You wouldn't want a cloud provider to be able to read your information. The consumer is also responsible for access security, meaning only giving access to those who need it. And some things, the responsibility depends on the situation. If you're using a cloud SQL or a cloud SQL database, the cloud provider will be responsible for maintaining the actual database. With an on-premises data center, you're responsible for everything. With cloud computing, those responsibilities shift. The shared responsibility model is heavily tied into cloud service types, and I'll cover them in more detail during this learning series. Infrastructure as a service. You might see that as IaaS. Platform as a service, you might see as PaaS, and software as a service, you might see as SaaS. You will always be responsible for the information and data stored in the cloud, devices that are allowed to connect to your cloud, cell phones, computers, and so on and so forth, the accounts and identities of the people and services and devices within your organization. The cloud provider is always responsible for the physical data center, the physical networks, the physical host. Your service model will determine the responsibility for things like operating systems, network controls, applications, identity, and infrastructure. So I hope that this section made it clear on the shared responsibility model. Let's start with a private cloud. A private cloud is in some ways the natural evolution from the corporate data center. It's a cloud delivering IT services over the internet that's used by a single entity. Private cloud provides much greater control for the company and its IT department. However, it also comes with a greater cost and fewer of the benefits of a public cloud deployment. Finally, a private cloud may be hosted from your on-site data center, and it may also be hosted in a dedicated data center off-site, potentially even by a third party that has dedicated that data center for your company. So again, with a private cloud, there's a lot more risk associated and upfront costs. So that's why, a lot of companies tend to migrate their services to a public cloud. Now let's talk about a public cloud. A public cloud is built, controlled, and maintained by a third-party cloud provider. In this case, Microsoft. With a public cloud, anyone that wants to purchase cloud services can access and use resources. The general public availability is key difference between public and private clouds. A hybrid cloud is a computing environment that uses both public and private clouds in an interconnected environment. A hybrid cloud environment can be used to allow a private cloud to surge for increased temporary demand by deploying public cloud resources. Hybrid clouds can be used to provide an extra layer of security. For example, users can flexibility to choose which services to keep in public cloud and which deploy to their private cloud infrastructures. So let's take a look at a quick comparison because I always feel like you need to see it side by side to understand. So one thing I do want to talk about in addition to what you see on the screen is multi-cloud. A fourth and increasingly likely scenario is a multi-cloud scenario. In a multi-cloud scenario, you will use multiple public cloud providers, so such as Microsoft Azure, Amazon's AWS, or Google's Google Cloud is examples of different multi-clouds that you can have in one environment. Maybe you use different features from different cloud providers, or maybe you started a cloud journey with one provider and in the process of migrating to a different provider. Regardless, in a multi-cloud environment, you deal with two or more public cloud providers and manage resources and securities in both environments. Luckily for you, Microsoft has a solution called Azure Arc. And Azure Arc is a set of technology that help you manage your environment. Azure Arc can be help manage your cloud environment, whether it's a public cloud solely on Microsoft Azure, a private cloud in your own data center, a hybrid configuration, or even a multi-cloud environment running on multiple cloud providers at once. I will be creating a training that you'll be able to find on my YouTube channel that covers Azure Arc in more details, but that's outside the scope of this exam. But I did want you to know this. So I know a lot of you are taking AWS certifications as well as GCP, and that's a good thing because a lot of companies that I work with leverage multi-cloud environments. So let's also talk about Azure VMware solutions. What if you're already established with VMware in your private cloud environment, but you want to migrate to the public or hybrid cloud? Azure VMware solution lets you do just that. Run your VMware workloads in Microsoft Azure with seamless integration and scalability. So now let's take a look at CapEx versus OpEx. So what does CapEx even stand for? Capital expenditure. Why am I telling you this? Because this is really the business behind the technical benefits that you gain. So capital expenditure, or CapEx for short, allows you to spend on physical infrastructure upfront, deduct the expenses from your tax bill, high upfront costs, but the value of your investment reduces over time. In contrast, operational expenditure, or OpEx, spends on services or product as needing, gets billed immediately, deduct the expenses from your tax bill in the same year, no upfront costs, and pay as you use. So that's why the cloud has taken off, because now businesses don't have to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars of getting their solution off the ground. They can gradually spend and have an operating expense. So the best thing I like to say, every month you pay for your light bill, but you don't pay one lump sum. Depends on how much your usage is. And the same thing goes for your public cloud. Now let's talk about consumption-based models. When comparing IT infrastructure models, there are two types of expenses to consider, and we talked about this in the last slide. Capital expenditure, CapEx, and operational expenditure, OpEx. CapEx is typically one-time upfront expenditure, right? In contrast, OpEx is spending money in service and products over time. Now let's talk about the consumption-based model, which brings many benefits. And let's talk about those benefits. No upfront costs. No need to purchase and manage costly infrastructure that may or may not use it to the fullest. The ability to pay additional resources when they are needed. The ability to stop paying for resources no longer when it's needed, right? So let me just talk about an example. I went into a dentist's office. They had a server on premises. The server broke. So what they had to do up front was pay a large amount of money to replace the server. It was a small dentist office, so they had to pay $5,000. If they would have had it in the cloud, they wouldn't have to worry about that fixed costs anymore, because now they will be paying for the usage. And the great thing about it is now it becomes just another expense. And this makes it easier, because now what if they end up buying another company, right? And now they have to offboard. That storage is in the cloud. You can expand and contract as quickly as you can, right? Also, you wouldn't have to move the server and reconfigure it. Then also, they didn't have any technical talent in-house, so they had to spend a lot of money on having a service provider provide the fixes of that solution. And also, they didn't really have a dedicated spot to keep the server in. So what if it rained? They would have to buy another one. So again, that's the benefit of the operational expense and this consumption model.